April 14th, 1943. The waters of the Solomon Islands lay dark and deceptive under a moonless sky, their surface broken only by the phosphorescent wake of the destroyer USS O'Bannon as she cut through the tropical night at 28 knots. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Donald MacDonald gripped the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon with an intensity that made his executive officer wonder if the captain had slept at all in the past 72 hours. The crew believed they were conducting a routine patrol, returning to base after escorting a supply convoy through the slot. They had no idea their commander was about to make a series of course corrections so bizarre, so seemingly random, that his own officers would question his sanity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them could have known was that MacDonald's inexplicable maneuvers over the next 47 minutes would thread their ship through an underwater gauntlet of 23 enemy torpedoes, turning what should have been certain destruction into one of the most extraordinary examples of intuition and seamanship in naval history. The evening had begun unremarkably enough. Ensign Robert Harris, barely 22 years old and fresh from the Naval Academy at Annapolis, stood his watch on the port wing of the bridge, binoculars raised against the humid tropical air. The O'Bannon, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing 2,100 tons and measuring 376 feet from stem to stern, had earned her reputation as a fighter. Her crew of 329 men had seen action at Guadalcanal, survived dive bomber attacks off Tulagi, and engaged in surface actions that left enemy cruisers burning on the horizon. But tonight felt different. Harris noticed it first in the way Commander MacDonald stood. The captain's usual confident posture had shifted into something else, something the young ensign could not quite identify. MacDonald kept turning his head at odd angles, as if listening to a sound just beyond the range of human hearing. Twice in the past hour, he had ordered course changes that made no tactical sense. The first had been a sudden turn to starboard, 30 degrees held for exactly 8 minutes before resuming base course. The second had been even stranger, a sharp zigzag pattern that left the helmsman exchanging worried glances with the officer of the deck. Lieutenant James Mitchell, the executive officer, approached the captain with careful deference. Mitchell was 31, a veteran of the Atlantic convoys before transferring to the Pacific, and he prided himself on understanding the rhythms and instincts of command at sea. But this was something new. "Captain, the men are wondering about our course," Mitchell said quietly, positioning himself so the rest of the bridge crew could not hear. "We are adding nearly an hour to our return time with these maneuvers." MacDonald did not turn to look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the black water ahead, his hands white-knuckled on the rail. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality that sent a chill down Mitchell's spine despite the tropical heat. "Jim, I need you to trust me on this. Something is out there. I can feel it. It is like there are eyes on us, not radar, not visual. Something else." Mitchell felt his stomach tighten. The captain was describing something that sounded dangerously close to superstition, or worse, the kind of battle fatigue that could get men relieved of command. But Donald MacDonald was no stranger to combat stress. He had commanded the O'Bannon through some of the most intense actions in the Pacific theater. If anything, he had proven himself steadier under fire than most men twice his age. "Sir, with respect, we have had no sonar contacts, no visual sightings. The radar shows nothing within 20 miles, except our own ships." "I know what the instruments say," MacDonald replied, and now he did turn to face his executive officer. His eyes were clear, focused, without a hint of the wild look that might indicate a man coming apart. "But I also know what I feel, and right now every instinct I have is screaming at me to alter course. So that is what we are going to do." He stepped to the helmsman. "Come left to heading 270, maintain speed." The order made no sense. Heading 270 would take them almost perpendicular to their planned route, adding miles to an already extended patrol. But the helmsman, a steady petty officer named Rodriguez, who had served with MacDonald since the ship's commissioning, executed the order without hesitation. "Left to 270, aye, sir. Steady on 270. What happened next would be reconstructed only later. pieced together from Japanese naval records captured after the war and the testimony of a submarine commander who survived the conflict. 4 miles ahead of the O'Bannon's original course, the Japanese submarine I-17 had been lying in wait, her crew having tracked the destroyer's progress for the past 2 hours. Commander Sakamoto Hideaki, a veteran submariner with 11 confirmed sinkings to his credit, had calculated his attack solution with meticulous precision. The American destroyer was following a predictable course at predictable speed. He had positioned his submarine at the optimal attack angle, loaded 6 Type 95 torpedoes into his forward tubes, and given the order to fire. 6 weapons, each carrying 660 pounds of explosive warhead, were already in the water when the O'Bannon made her inexplicable turn to port. Sakamoto, watching through his periscope, could not believe what he was seeing. The destroyer had altered course for no apparent reason, moving out of the torpedo spread with seconds to spare. The weapons, traveling at 49 knots, passed through empty water where the O'Bannon should have been, continuing on until their fuel was exhausted and they sank harmlessly into the depths. But Commander Sakamoto was not alone in these waters. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the Japanese Navy had deployed 3 submarines in a coordinated patrol pattern across the Solomon Sea. What MacDonald had wandered into was not a single threat, but a carefully laid trap designed to catch American destroyers operating in these waters. The I-17 was the western anchor of this patrol line. 2 miles to the east, the I-21 held station, and 3 miles beyond her, the I-19 completed the picket. Each submarine commander had been tracking the O'Bannon independently. Each had calculated firing solutions, and as MacDonald's seemingly random course changes took his ship on a weaving path through these waters, each commander in turn gave the order to fire. On the bridge of the O'Bannon, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Chief Petty Officer William Torres, the senior enlisted man on the bridge and a sailor with 19 years of service, had never seen anything like this. The captain was now ordering course changes every few minutes, sometimes holding the new heading for barely a minute before shifting again. The ship was zigzagging through the Solomon Sea like a drunk man walking home, and Torres could hear the murmuring among the younger sailors. "The old man's lost it," one whispered to another, not quietly enough. Torres turned with a glare that could have melted steel. "You will maintain silence on this bridge, or I will have you scrubbing bilges until the war ends. Is that clear?" "Chief, yes, Chief," came the subdued response. But Torres himself was beginning to wonder. He had served under 5 different captains in his career, sailed through 2 typhoons and a hurricane, and seen combat in both theaters of the war. He had learned to trust the judgment of officers who had proven themselves under fire. Donald MacDonald was one of those officers, but this behavior was beyond anything in Torres's experience. Lieutenant Mitchell approached the captain again, this time with more urgency in his voice. "Sir, I must insist we maintain a steady course. The engineering department is reporting unusual strain on the propulsion system from these constant maneuvers. And the crew, sir, the crew is beginning to question." MacDonald's response was to suddenly grip Mitchell's arm with surprising force, his gaze locked on something in the darkness ahead. "Right full rudder, right now." The helmsman, trained to respond instantly to emergency commands, threw the wheel hard over. The O'Bannon heeled into the turn, men grabbing for handholds as the deck tilted beneath them. The destroyer came around in a tight arc, her wake boiling white in the darkness. And then they saw it. A phosphorescent trail in the water, moving at high speed, passed down the port side barely 50 yards from the hull. Then another, and another. 3 parallel wakes, glowing faintly in the tropical sea, racing past the ship and continuing into the night. Torpedoes. The bridge fell silent. Every man who had been questioning the captain's sanity a moment before now stood frozen, watching those deadly wakes recede into the darkness. If MacDonald had not ordered that turn, if they had held their previous course for another 30 seconds, at least one of those weapons would have found its mark. "Sonar, bridge," Mitchell called into the communication tube, his voice tight. "Did you have any contacts before those fish?" "Bridge, sonar, negative contact. We heard nothing until the torpedoes were already past us, which meant they had come from a submarine lying in wait. Silent. undetected. A submarine whose commander had been tracking them had calculated their course and speed, had fired his weapons at what should have been certain range, and only MacDonald's inexplicable course change had saved them. But the night was far from over. Ensign Harris, who had been maintaining the deck log, made a notation of the time and the torpedo sighting. 2213 hours. 3 torpedoes observed passing port side. Ship took evasive action. No damage sustained. It was dry, official language for what had been a brush with death so close that several men later admitted they had been preparing to abandon ship. MacDonald seemed not to notice the change in atmosphere on the bridge. If anything, his behavior became even more erratic. He was pacing now, moving from one side of the bridge to the other, his head cocked at that odd angle, still listening to something no one else could hear. "Come left to 235, he ordered. "Increase speed to 30 knots. The engine room responded, the destroyer's power plant pushing her through the water faster, her hull vibrating with the strain. And then, not 5 minutes later, right to 290, reduced to 25 knots. Mitchell no longer questioned. He simply relayed the orders, watching as his captain navigated by some internal compass that defied all conventional naval doctrine. The crew, too, had stopped murmuring. The sight of those torpedoes had transformed skepticism into something approaching awe. What they could not know, what would only become clear when Japanese records were examined years later, was that Commander Sakamoto had surfaced his submarine and radioed the other boats in the patrol line. The American destroyer was behaving erratically, he reported, making it impossible to establish a firing solution, but she was moving generally eastward, which would bring her into the patrol areas of the I-21 and I-19. The trap was still set. The prey was simply proving more elusive than anticipated. Commander Nakamura aboard the I-21 received Sakamoto's transmission and prepared his own attack. He had 6 torpedoes remaining in his tubes after an earlier engagement with an American freighter. He positioned his submarine carefully, calculating not just the destroyer's current position, but attempting to predict where these random course changes might take her. It was like trying to shoot a bird that flew without pattern, but Nakamura was patient. He waited, and when the O'Bannon's latest zigzag brought her onto an easterly heading that she held for more than 2 minutes, he gave the order to fire 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern. On the O'Bannon's bridge, MacDonald suddenly stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then he turned to the helmsman with absolute calm in his voice. "Left full rudder. All engines ahead flank. Sound general quarters." The general alarm began its raucous clanging throughout the ship. Men who had been dozing in their bunks rolled out and ran for their battle stations. In the engine room, throttles were open to their maximum. The O'Bannon surged forward into a hard turn that put her almost on her beam ends, the sea coming up to the edge of the deck. The 4 torpedoes from the I-21 arrived exactly where the O'Bannon would have been if she had maintained her previous course. They passed through empty water in a perfect spread pattern, weapons that would have bracketed the destroyer and guaranteed at least 2 hits. Instead, they continued on their programmed runs until their fuel was exhausted. Lieutenant Mitchell, now at his battle station in the Combat Information Center, was plotting the torpedo tracks on the chart. What he saw made his blood run cold. 7 torpedoes so far, from at least 2 different submarines, and the pattern suggested they were sailing through a coordinated patrol line, which meant there could be more, perhaps many more. He called up to the bridge. "Captain, recommend we clear the area at maximum speed on a heading that takes us out of these waters." MacDonald's voice came back through the speaker, and there was something in it now that Mitchell had never heard before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of intense concentration that suggested a man walking a tightrope over an abyss. "Negative, Jim. If we run, we die. These boats are positioned to catch ships fleeing. Our only chance is to keep doing what we are doing. Stay unpredictable. Give them nothing to calculate." It was madness. It was tactical insanity. It was also, Mitchell realized with a clarity that was almost painful, probably their only hope. A destroyer at flank speed running a straight course was a target any submarine commander could hit. But a destroyer executing random maneuvers, never holding course long enough for a firing solution to be calculated, was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. The third submarine, I-19 under Commander Fujimoto, had been tracking the O'Bannon for the past 20 minutes. Fujimoto was considered one of the finest submarine commanders in the Imperial Japanese Navy, with a reputation for patience and precision that had earned him the nickname the Calculator among his peers. He had listened to the radio reports from Sakamoto and Nakamura. He had observed the American destroyer's erratic behavior, and unlike his colleagues, he had formed a theory. The American commander was not executing random maneuvers. There was a pattern, subtle but present. The turns came in intervals that varied, but centered around a mean of approximately 4 minutes. The heading changes, while seemingly arbitrary, showed a preference for certain compass points. Fujimoto believed he could predict the next move. He positioned his submarine based on this analysis, loaded all 6 of his remaining torpedoes, and waited. When the O'Bannon made her next turn, Fujimoto tracked the maneuver carefully. Yes, the pattern held. He could see where she would turn next. He gave the order to fire all 6 weapons in a carefully calculated spread that would cover every probable position the destroyer might take in the next 3 minutes. It was a brilliant piece of tactical analysis. It was also completely wrong. Because Donald MacDonald was not following any pattern. He was not executing a pre-planned evasion scheme. He was not relying on any tactical doctrine taught at any naval academy. He was following his instincts, pure and raw, the product of years at sea and combat experience that had honed his awareness to something approaching precognition. And at the moment Fujimoto's torpedoes entered the water, MacDonald felt it again. That pressure, that sense of wrongness in a particular direction. Hard right rudder. Come to heading 315. All engines stop. The last order brought shocked silence to the bridge. All engines stop. In the middle of evasive maneuvers against submarine attack. It was the equivalent of standing still in the middle of a gunfight. But Rodriguez, the helmsman, had stopped questioning. He executed the orders exactly as given. The O'Bannon swung to starboard, and then, as her engines cut out, began to coast, her momentum carrying her forward but her speed dropping rapidly. Fujimoto's 6 torpedoes, calculated for a target moving at 30 knots, passed ahead of the O'Bannon's position. They had been aimed at where she should have been, would have been, if any normal commander had been at the helm. Instead, they ran through empty ocean, while the American destroyer sat almost dead in the water, her engines silent. On the bridge, Ensign Harris was counting. He had started when he saw the first torpedo wake, and he was now up to 16. 16 torpedoes that had been fired at them in the past 30 minutes. 16 weapons, any one of which could have broken the O'Bannon in half, sent her and her crew of 329 men to the bottom of the Solomon Sea. And not one had found its mark. Commander Sakamoto, surfacing his submarine to ventilate and recharge batteries, reported back to his superiors that the American destroyer appeared to have some kind of new detection equipment. There was no other explanation for the evasive maneuvers. The ship was responding to attacks before the torpedoes were even in the water, as if the commander could see through the ocean itself. The report was forwarded up the chain of command and would eventually reach naval intelligence analysts in Tokyo, who would spend considerable effort trying to determine what new American technology had been deployed. They would never discover the truth, that it was not technology at all but the instincts of one man, honed by experience and pressure into something that appeared almost supernatural. But the night was not finished with the O'Bannon. Commander MacDonald ordered engines ahead slow, bringing the ship up to just 10 knots, barely enough for steerage. He was listening again, his entire body tense with concentration. Mitchell, watching from the Combat Information Center, realized what the captain was doing. By reducing speed to almost nothing, he was making the ship harder to hear. Submarines tracked their targets primarily by sound, by the distinctive throb of propellers and the machinery noise of a ship underway. At 10 knots, the O'Bannon was almost silent, a ghost drifting through hostile waters. But she was also vulnerable. At this speed, she could not maneuver quickly if another attack developed. It was a calculated risk, and Mitchell found himself praying that MacDonald's instincts were as sharp as they had been for the past half hour. The 3 Japanese submarines, having exhausted their torpedo loads, were now faced with a decision. Protocol dictated that they surface and pursue with deck guns. The O'Bannon, while armed with 5-inch guns that could outrange anything the submarines carried, was alone and had been under continuous attack. There was a reasonable chance she had sustained damage, perhaps had casualties that would affect her combat effectiveness. Commander Sakamoto made the decision to surface. The I-17 broke the surface 2 miles astern of the O'Bannon, seawater cascading from her hull as she rode up from the depths. Her deck gun crew scrambled to their positions, preparing to engage, and on the O'Bannon, the radar operator called out the contact with something approaching joy in his voice. Bridge, radar, surface contact bearing 180, range 3,800 yards, closing. MacDonald's voice was calm, almost gentle. Very well. All engines ahead full. Come right to 180. Gun director, take that contact under fire the moment you have a solution. The transformation was immediate. The O'Bannon, which had been creeping through the water like a wounded animal, suddenly roared to life. Her engines went to full power, her bow coming up as she accelerated, and she turned directly toward the surfaced submarine like a bull charging a matador. The 5-inch guns, mounted in 2 twin turrets forward and 1 aft, trained on the target. Fire control radar locked on, and when the range closed to 3,000 yards, the forward turrets opened fire. The first salvo straddled the I-17, shells landing in the water on both sides. The second salvo found the range. 2 5-inch shells, each weighing 55 pounds, struck the submarine's conning tower and forward deck. The Japanese gun crew who had been preparing to fire were caught in the explosions. Men were thrown into the sea or simply ceased to exist. Commander Sakamoto, recognizing that he had made a catastrophic error, gave the order to dive. But the O'Bannon was closing at 35 knots now, her guns firing rapidly, shell after shell hammering into the submarine's hull. The I-17 managed to get beneath the surface, but she was trailing oil and air bubbles, clear signs of damage. MacDonald ordered a depth charge attack, and the O'Bannon roared over the submarine's last known position, her stern racks releasing a pattern of 6 charges set for shallow detonation. The explosions sent columns of water shooting into the air, and when they subsided, a larger oil slick was spreading across the surface. The I-17 would not return to base. She would be found after the war, her hull split open by the 5-inch guns and depth charges, lying in 400 feet of water with all hands lost. The other 2 submarines, hearing the engagement over their hydrophones, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They slipped away into the depths, abandoning the patrol line and reporting only that they had engaged an American destroyer with advanced detection capabilities. On the bridge of the O'Bannon, as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, Lieutenant Mitchell made his way up from the Combat Information Center. He found MacDonald standing at the rail again, looking out at the sea as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Sir," Mitchell said carefully, "I need to ask, how did you know? The course changes, the torpedo evasions. How did you know where they were?" MacDonald was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost wondering. "Jim, I wish I could tell you. I wish I could point to something on a chart or a reading on an instrument panel. But the truth is I do not know, I just felt it. Like there was a weight in certain directions, a pressure that told me not to go that way. So I have been at sea since I was 18 years old. Maybe that is all it was. Pattern recognition at some level I cannot articulate. Or maybe it was just luck. Extraordinary, impossible luck." Mitchell shook his head. "Sir, with respect, that was not luck. I was plotting every torpedo track. You evaded attacks from 3 different submarines, weapons fired from positions we could not detect, along courses we could not predict, and you evaded every single one. That is not luck, that is something else." The final count, verified from Japanese naval records examined after the war, was 23 torpedoes fired at the USS O'Bannon during that 47-minute period in the Solomon Sea. 23 weapons, representing over 15,000 pounds of explosive power, any one of which could have sent the destroyer to the bottom, and not a single hit. The story spread through the Pacific Fleet with the speed of legend. Other destroyer captains studied MacDonald's patrol report, trying to find some tactical lesson they could apply. What they found instead was a series of course changes that appeared random, maneuvers that violated doctrine, and decisions that seemed to make no sense until viewed with the knowledge of where the torpedoes had been. Ensign Harris, who had kept the deck log that night, would later write in his personal journal, "I watched a man navigate by instinct through a field of death that would have claimed any ship with a conventional commander. If I had not been there, if I had not seen the torpedo wakes pass where we would have been, I would not believe it possible. But I was there, and I saw what I saw, and I will never doubt human intuition again." Chief Petty Officer Torres, the senior enlisted man, had a simpler assessment. He told his wife in a letter written 2 days later, "The old man has a guardian angel, or maybe he is the angel. Either way, I would sail with him into hell itself, because I know he would find a way to sail us back out again." Commander MacDonald received the Navy Cross for his actions that night, though the citation was carefully worded to emphasize tactical skill and evasive maneuvers rather than the inexplicable nature of his navigation. The Navy, then as now, was more comfortable with explanations that fit within established doctrine. But among the men who served on the O'Bannon, the story took on mythic proportions: the destroyer that could not be hit, the captain who could see through water. The night when instinct defeated calculation and survived what should have been unsurvivable. MacDonald himself never spoke much about the incident. When pressed by reporters after the war, he would simply say that he had learned to trust his feelings at sea, that years of experience created a kind of knowledge that could not be measured or taught. He deflected praise to his crew, to the skill of his helmsman and the professionalism of his engineering department. But those who knew him best, who served with him through the remainder of the war, noticed something that changed after that night. A quality of confidence that went beyond the normal assurance of command, an awareness that seemed to extend beyond the visible horizon, and a willingness to trust his instincts even when they contradicted every instrument, every chart, every established rule of naval warfare. The O'Bannon would go on to survive the war with one of the most distinguished combat records of any destroyer in the Pacific Fleet. She would participate in the battles of Empress Augusta Bay, the interception of the Tokyo Express, and the Philippines campaign. She would be credited with sinking or damaging numerous enemy vessels, and through it all, she would never take a single torpedo hit. Despite operating in some of the most heavily contested waters of the war, some attributed this to MacDonald's skill, others to the exceptional training of her crew. But those who were on the bridge that April night in 1943 knew there was something more. Something that could not be quantified in after-action reports or analyzed in tactical studies. The 3 Japanese submarine commanders who survived their encounter with the O'Bannon would each, independently, report something similar in their patrol logs. That the American destroyer had moved as if guided by supernatural forces. That her maneuvers had no pattern yet perfectly countered every attack. That engaging her had felt like fighting a ghost that could sense danger before it materialized. Commander Fujimoto, the calculator, would later admit in a captured diary that the experience had shaken his confidence in pure tactical analysis. He wrote, "We practice our art with mathematics and precision, believing that calculation will always defeat chaos. But tonight I witnessed chaos that was not chaos at all, but rather an order too complex for my equations to capture. The American commander operated on a level I could not reach with all my training and experience. It was humbling. It was terrifying." The story of that night would be passed down through generations of Navy officers, often embellished, sometimes doubted, but never forgotten. It became a case study in trusting intuition, in the limits of technology, and in the mysterious alchemy that transforms experience into something approaching prescience. Years after the war, a young naval officer interviewing veterans for a thesis on Pacific destroyer operations asked MacDonald directly, "Did you really dodge 23 torpedoes that night, or has the story grown in the telling?" MacDonald's answer was characteristically modest. "Son, I do not know if it was 23 or 20 or 15. I was not counting. I was just trying to keep my ship and my crew alive. But I do know this. There were moments that night when I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to turn. Not thought, not calculated, but knew. And I did. And we survived. Whether that was skill or instinct or divine intervention, I cannot say, but I am grateful for it, whatever it was." The USS O'Bannon was decommissioned in 1946, her war service complete. She was eventually scrapped, her steel recycled into the peacetime economy. But the memory of her most extraordinary night remained, preserved in Navy records, in the recollections of her crew, and in the captured Japanese logs that documented the impossible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.